introduce Dan Roper. I'm sure a lot of you already know him. He's just a kind of a Renaissance man. He does a lot of different things. He lives in Armurchie. He has 3 children. He practiced law for 19 years in Rome before becoming editor and publisher of Georgia Backroads magazine. Dan has led tree walks, bird walks, and is a frequent speaker on the Civil War. He was my inspiration in exploring local history. Dan identified an old store ledger that was loaned to me by a neighbor, and he found out it was from the McGuire store sometime prior to the Civil War. He also wrote an article in this magazine, and this was winter 2004, based on that ledger. So he really inspired me to be part of this group and to see us keep exploring our history around here. So I know that you're going to enjoy his talk tonight, and thank you for coming. And like I say, we'll have a short business meeting and refreshments after the meeting. Thank you, and here we go, Dan. Let's see if I can put this on.
I'm going to leave that there for just a minute and see if my voice carries enough. I see one head shaking. No, it does not shake. Anybody else? All right, I'm going to try it for a few minutes, and if you guys don't hear me, we got 2 options. One is you can move closer, and the other is just hold up your hand and I'll know I need to speak even louder. Jennifer was kind to say, I'm a Renaissance man. That's the second time that term has been used in the last year. The first time was by Randy Davis on the radio program one day, and I felt pretty good. I didn't know what it meant, but I felt pretty good about it until I got back to my office, and my wife called me. She said, "You know what a Renaissance man means?" And I said, "No, what does it mean?" She said, "That means you're strange." And if you like birds and history and stamps and those kind of things, when you're in high school, you know what that means. You're in trouble. But I do enjoy those things. I love Georgia history. And I remember when Jennifer came to my office in Rome one day about 10 years ago with the store ledger from McGuire's. And there was very little on that ledger. What didn't identify the names or the date or the location. She just knew that it had come from an attic in a house here. And we took that, and through a lot of hard work and fun digging through records, we eventually ascertained the location, McGuire's store, and the date, which had to be sometime between 1860 and 1864. And through census records and other things, we were able to cobble together the stories of the people that were listed on that store ledger. It was one of my favorite stories that I ever worked on. Oddly enough, the title of that story became "For the Sin of the Fathers." And it was organized around the idea that many of the people listed in the store ledger were slave owners, including a number of preachers from this community. And those preachers' sons were killed in battle. And so we looked at it through, that was the center point or the focal point for the story. And it mentioned people like McGuire and Pinson, Davis, and so forth. And those men had the people of this valley had contributed 8 soldiers to the Rome Light Guards, Company A of the 8th Georgia Regiment. And that was one of the elite units in the Army of Northern Virginia during the Civil War. So when you begin with a store ledger and you end up in the Army of Northern Virginia, the stories of these young boys who, many of them were killed in action, some of them lost limbs in the war. It was just a great story. So that's the way history begins. Little things lead to fascinating events. That's the way it was with the story that I'm going to tell you about tonight. During my years of writing, I think I've done dozens and dozens of stories that have been published in Georgia Backroads and a few other publications. But one of them is just the closest to my heart. And perhaps as I explain to you this story or tell you this story, you'll see why it would become something that just meant a lot to me personally. Even though I'm not from Floyd County originally and have no family here, no roots in this county at all, you start digging around with families and stories and people, and you begin to feel like you are a part of a community, as indeed my wife and I and our children do now in Floyd County. This particular story resulted in two magazine articles that were published in 2006 and 2009. And I began the 2009 story this way. The last time I visited her grave, a waning moon hung in the western or the eastern sky, and orange streaks creased the horizon. It was a cold day in late winter. As I made my way through the brush to the abandoned cemetery off the road. And when I arrived at that cemetery before dawn, there were 4 marked grave sites, tombstones. And I recognized the names of all 4 from previous visits. There was a gravestone for a man named J.P. Gray, and for 2 little boys named King, and for a little girl named Beulah Buchanan. And all 4 of them had died between 1917 and around 1923, within close proximity to one another. And I recall the first time that I had visited that gravesite, and that had been about 15 years before, when my wife and I were riding our bicycles, and somehow we knew the location of that little cemetery. I don't recall how we knew it, but we got off our bikes and walked back into the woods, and we found those tombstones. And I remember being curious at the time about them because I recognized the names from the Armurchie community. King, a fairly common name, and Bray, which is no longer a common name, but I had recognized it from the history of the community. But the name Beulah Buchanan mystified me, because to the best of my knowledge at that time, there were no Buchanans in Armurchie. Buchanan is a name you don't find today. I've never come across the name Buchanan in any of my historical writing and research about Armurchie. So how did this little girl, Beulah Buchanan, end up in this abandoned and forgotten cemetery off the road? That puzzled me. Buchanan? No. In Armurchie, Davis or Beard or Duke or Yarborough or Salmon or Selman? Yes. Buchanan? No. So how did she end up in that cemetery? And about once or twice every year, I would find my way back to that cemetery. I'd be riding my bicycle or walking out on that property, and I would stop and walk out there, and it would renew my interest in the little girl. Who was she? Who was her family? What happened to this community? And what happened to her that would have resulted in her being buried here on Thanksgiving Day, 1917? Well, I didn't find anything in my casual research over the course of a number of years, but figured that one day I would turn my attention to it more fully. And that day came in 2006, when my own daughter reached the age of 12 years. And that was the same age that Beulah Buchanan was when she died and was buried there. And thinking about my own daughter, it made me realize it's a shame for a young girl to die and to be buried and to be all but forgotten over the course of 80 or 90 years. Nobody knew who she was, who her family was, what had happened to her. And so, with my interest in her story reinforced, I began to diligently research all that I could about the community and about Beulah Buchanan and her family. But I couldn't find anything. And then one day, I guess in desperation, I posted a question to a genealogical website devoted to Floyd County. And very quickly, a lady from Gadsden, Alabama replied. I guess she was interested in the story, and she had done some research in the census records and had found a little bit of information, but it was important because it was the first information I had beyond what little I knew. What she had found was that Beulah Buchanan was the child of a John and Laura Buchanan, who in 1910 were mill workers in Lindale at the sprawling Massachusetts mill, the textile mill, as most of us know. And then they were able to go back 10 years to 1900 census when Beulah Buchanan, before she was born, and before her little brother was born, and John and Laura Buchanan were 18-year-old newlyweds that worked in the textile mill in Tryon, the Regal mill there in Tryon. So it was, you had a little pattern there already. You could tell that John and Laura Buchanan were textile mill workers. By 1910, they had a little boy named Paul, and then little Laura, who was, I'm going to have to do the math real quick, I believe she was 6 years old in 1910. That's right. So I knew that much, but the trail went cold there. There was no mention of a John and Laura Buchanan in the 1920 census for Floyd County, 1930 census. They disappeared from evidence. So we were at a loss, except there was one item of interest, and that was that this lady had found an indication that there was a Paul Buchanan who was an inmate in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta in the 1920 census. Now, there was no reason we didn't know if that Paul Buchanan was the same as Laura's brother, but it might be. That was the only thing else that we had to go on. And so on a June afternoon in 2008, I drove down to the National Archives in College Park, their new facility, and walked in and asked to see for the criminal record file on Paul Buchanan. And lo and behold, within 5 minutes, a very helpful clerk brought out to me a very thick file that had the criminal proceeding records on this Paul Buchanan, who had been an inmate in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta in 1920. And so I opened that file, and the first thing I saw was a picture of Paul Buchanan. And he was, as I recall, a handsome young man. He had wavy blonde hair, probably longer than average in 1920, but not long, but very wavy. That was what I recall about him. Dirty blonde hair. It was a black and white picture, but it said that he had blue eyes. And there was all kinds of interesting information included in his criminal record file. The fact that he was a Methodist, not a Baptist. That he was, of course, that's why, Baptists have all the rules so they don't get in trouble. Like but that's what I and said that he did not smoke or use alcohol. Wait a minute, that means he was a Baptist, doesn't it? And he was a car mechanic, and him and his wife did not have children. So, and that was all the information that they gave. It said that he had been a car mechanic in Macon. No link or ties whatsoever to Floyd County. The trail had gone cold at that point, but I read on through to see if there was any hint of anything of interest in there. And at the very end of the file, there was a list of correspondence that had gone out from the jail, from his hand, and that had come in addressed to him. All that correspondence list included was the addressee that it was going to, and then the addressee that it was coming from, or the addressor that it was coming from. And there was one item of interest, potential interest, in that list, and that was that Paul Buchanan had received correspondence from a J.W. Buchanan in Gadsden, Alabama, his father. So I wondered, could possibly Paul Buchanan's J.W. Buchanan, the father, could that be the same as John Buchanan, who had been in Tryon and Lindale in 1900 and 1910? and now is for some reason in Gadsden, Alabama in 1920. That was the big question. Wasn't sure, but thought that's worth following up on. So came back and we continued into the research, and we found the verification that J.W. Buchanan and John Buchanan were one and the same. The way we found that was that there was a draft card for Paul Buchanan. He was in the Army in 1918, not in World War I. He was involved in the Mexican troubles, is what the card said, down there chasing Pancho Villa on the border, and across the border, I think, if I remember correctly. And that draft card said that his father was John W. Buchanan. So that gave us some additional clues, and we were able to pull some further census records and confirm that John Buchanan of Lindale in 1910 had left under circumstances I'll tell you about in just a moment, and moved to Gadsden. That's where he was by 1920. So now we're beginning to put together that Beulah Buchanan laying dead in the North Floyd County Cemetery in 1917 is the daughter of John and Laura Buchanan. We know that John and Laura Buchanan were textile mill workers, and that their children, in all likelihood, would have been candidates to be child laborers in the textile mills. Some of you may be very familiar with the fact that in the early 1900s, it was very common for very young children to work in the textile mills of Northwest Georgia, including in this community. Children as young as 7 years old, but very frequently children 10 and 11 and 12 years old and so forth were workers in the textile mills. We have some great pictures of those from the Library of Congress. Just very moving, including pictures that were taken of the Massachusetts mill. No name is given, and I've often looked at them. I have about 10 or 15 photos of young girls and young boys, and I've often wondered if one of those faces might not be Beulah Buchanan. She would have been in 1910, 6 years old, in 1912, 8 years old, 1913, of course, and so on. She would have been of the age to have potentially worked in those textile mills, and certainly with her parents both being textile mill workers, that's quite likely. I certainly imagine that her older brother, Paul, would have been what they would call a linthead, right? I think that's the term that was often used for youngsters, maybe anybody that worked in a textile mill. Sometime between 1910 and 1920, Laura Buchanan disappears from sight. She vanishes. The mother. And we didn't know why. And then John reappears in 1920 in Gadsden with a new wife that's much younger than him. And he has a whole new family, 5 more children that were born between 1920 and 1935, which isn't that long ago, is it? Some of those kids could still be alive. And I'll get back to that in just a moment. But we were curious, what happened to Laura Buchanan? What happened to Beulah that somehow she gets separated from this family in Lindale and ends up being buried in the Grayton or Central Grove community that's on the Berry College campus today? How did she end up there? What's the connection? And how did her brother end up in Macon repairing cars? Again, we couldn't make the connection. Further research showed us that sometime between 1910 and 1912, Laura Buchanan died. The mother died. And that left John Buchanan with a young family. There were actually 3 of them by that point. There was a little boy, a newborn, and perhaps Laura died in childbirth. And John found himself in an uncomfortable situation, a young dad. He was a renter, didn't make a good wage, and had 3 children on his charge, probably unable to care for them, or thinking that he was unable to care for them. And he did what a lot of folks do, he gave up, or he gave in. And the children left. Paul was old enough to just leave home at the age of 13 and end up in Macon, and then end up in the federal penitentiary. But what about Laura? I mean, what about Beulah and her little baby brother? How did they go from there? Well, one day I was in church, and I had already explained to some of the folks I go to church with, I was having trouble with this. And one day a man named Larry Kinsey, who lives on Floyd Springs Road, came to me with Batty's history And he found the name Beulah Buchanan in there. Not under the last name Buchanan, though. Under the name Beulah Buchanan Titchery. No wonder I couldn't find it. Titchery. And I thought, goodness, don't tell me she got married at age 12. Well, she did. Turned out that there was a young agriculture professor at Berry College from Minnesota named Olive Titchery. And he had come down from Minnesota to Georgia in the early 1900s to teach agriculture at the New Berry schools. And so, as many of you folks know, Martha Berry was fond of taking in the children of poor Appalachian farmers and textile mill workers. And so the Titchery family took in Beulah Buchanan and her baby brother, who they renamed John, whose actual name was Clyde. And the agriculture professor, Olive Titchery, lived on a farm called Pine Haven. Anybody ever heard of Pine Haven? It was located on what is now called the old CCC Road that runs from the old Somerville Road out towards Mountain Springs Church. Some of you will know what I'm talking about. Others of you haven't been out there. It's a gated road on the Berry College campus. But if you happen to have been out on that old dirt road and you go out there a ways, about a mile on the left, there's an old concrete silo that sits back in the woods a good ways. Just in the pine woods. Old concrete silo. That was Pine Haven. That was where Olive Titchery lived and farmed when he wasn't teaching. And that's where Beulah Buchanan grew up. After she was removed from the child labor situation and brought into the home of this agriculture professor at Berry College. And you might imagine that her prospects would have improved in all likelihood under that scenario. Now she had a father and a mother who believed in education, didn't want her working in textile mills, wanted her to be educated, and she was. She showed off a new breed of chickens at an agriculture fair in Floyd County and won a scholarship to the University of Georgia to attend an agricultural seminar there during the summer months 1 year. She was in the Sunday school class in a little church called Central Grove, actually called Duke's Chapel. And she was in the Sunday school class there. She was active in the school and so on, and doing very well in that community, in that setting. Had very good prospects, it looked like, going forward. But what happened to her? On Thanksgiving Day, 1917, she passed away. That was the last piece of the puzzle. We knew who her family was, what became of him, why a Buchanan was buried in Armurchie where no Buchanan had dared to go before. But what had happened to her? That she would die when she was just 12 years old. Well, I thought the obvious thing was to go look in the Rome News Tribune archives, the microfilm of the library, to see if there might be an obituary. But they didn't do obituaries in 1917. Unless you were a very well-known person, a prominent member of the community, they might do an obituary for. Like Johnny Davis, he would be so famous that they would have to do one for him. But if you weren't famous, or if you didn't die in some spectacular way, like get run over by a mule while you were plowing, you just weren't, you wouldn't be mentioned in the newspaper. They didn't even call them obituaries in that day and time. Anybody here know what they called them? Good. I like to spring little tidbits on you. They're called necrologies, all right? So I began to look through the Rome News Tribune archives and microfilm for necrologies around 1917, starting about a week before Thanksgiving Day, to see perhaps if she had been sick, if there might be a mention of it, anything. And I started forward. Any of you that have worked with microfilm knows that after a short time, you're going to have a headache. It's not fun. It's disastrous, especially if your eyes are not, if you don't have 20/20 vision, it's just an ordeal. And so I began in mid-November 1917, began to work forward, and by December 4th of 1917, there were two things. One, there was no mention of Beulah Buchanan, and two, I had a headache. I was growing very weary very fast and thought, well, we're 2 weeks now after Thanksgiving, we're close to it. They're not going to mention it now. And I thought, I'll give it 2 more days. 2 more days, and then I give up. And the next day, December 5th, turned to page 2, and it said Central Grove. And I knew without reading it that I was about to find out what happened to Beulah. And I began to read. It was a very short little blurb. Back in those days, as many of you might remember, correspondents from communities like Shannon or Armurchie or Everett Springs or Flatwoods or Utopia School would write in little paragraphs about who visited who and who went on a visit where and whose arm was broken, whose chickens were crowing too loud. Very interesting little gossipy things that are probably prohibited in the Bible but not in the Roman history. And it was full of gossipy little things. People having trouble with their possum chasing dogs and all kinds of fun little things. But in there, it said that Beulah Buchanan had died on Thanksgiving Day. And it said, the only thing it said was that she had passed quickly after an onset of serious convulsions. She died, and the next day, her body was carried about a mile on a wagon road to the old, small church cemetery, and she was buried there with 3 other people, with her grave soon to be forgotten. So what had happened? There was no other clue in there, nothing I could find. I needed a resource, somebody that might be able to take a few fragments of evidence or clues and perhaps come up with a conjecture or surmise that would tell us something more. So I called on David Kearns, retired pathologist who's relaxed and cordial most of the time. He doesn't intimidate me. And so one day, I don't remember if I called him or just wrote him a letter. And I just said, David, this is not much to work with, but can you tell me anything based upon this short newspaper report about Beulah Buchanan? Went into convulsions, died within an hour or so. And David was kind enough to not be concerned that I was going to sue him for malpractice or, how can I, base a diagnosis on this sketchy little information. It was enough for him to come up with 3 hypotheses. One is, I think that he wrote back and said it might be status epilepticus, which is the immediate or quick onset of fatal epileptic seizures. He said, I don't think it was that, though, because there's no indication that she'd had them before. So probably the least likely of the 3. The second thing, I'm going to have to go back in my records now, but I believe the second thing he said was bacterial meningitis. Here, I'll just read you, rather than going from memory, so I don't misquote the good guy. Well, I asked Dr. David Kearns, a retired Roman pathologist, if he could deduce anything about Beulah's death from this newspaper account. He cautioned that a definitive diagnosis was impossible in the circumstances. That's a lot of big words, and that's probably not the way he said it. But noted that the sudden onset of seizures and Beulah's abrupt death are reasonably consistent with 3 possible disorders: bacterial meningitis, infectious encephalitis, and status epilepticus. Epilepsy, Dr. Kearns inferred, again, the writer is throwing in some extra words there. Epilepsy might be the least likely of the 3 in this instance, since the news account didn't indicate that Beulah's condition was recurring, although this might have been her first episode. The other 2 ailments were consistent with the report given, for they are each infectious diseases that can progress quickly, induce convulsions, and bring on a swift death. So I was at that point down to bacterial meningitis or infectious encephalitis. I felt pretty good now that we had a reasonably complete picture of the life and death of Beulah Buchanan. I don't think I've ever told David this, but not long after this story was published, I received a phone call from a man that lives on the old Somerville Road in Armurchie, and for some reason, he has a copy of a newspaper article from 1926, 9 years later, that says that she died from bacterial meningitis. The reason it was in the newspaper was that her younger brother, the baby brother that was adopted by the family, became a professor at Berry College. His name was Clyde Titchery. And in an article about him, it mentioned that his sister had died and was buried on the Berry property. So at long last, after all those years, about really about 15 years of searching, I finally knew the story of Beulah Buchanan. The next time I visited her grave, that early pre-dawn March morning, I walked out there and I pulled aside the brush and the briars, the old leaves. I cleaned off her grave and I looked at the canted tombstone and I said, "You have not been forgotten, Beulah Buchanan." And as long as I'm around to tell her story to people willing and interested in listening, I'm going to see to it that Beulah Buchanan, age 12, 1917, won't be forgotten. Are there any questions? I must have done a good job.
Yeah, well,
Yes, sir.
what was her brother in prison? Did you find that out?
Yeah, I kind of left that out, didn't I? No wonder there's a question. He was in prison for counterfeiting. In October of 1919, he was arrested. 12 days later, he was indicted, and the following day, he was tried and convicted of counterfeiting. He had taken a $1 bill, cut off the corner with the 1, and taped to that corner the 5 from the $5 bill. That man went to the federal penitentiary for a year and a half for $4. And that was not his first and last time in prison. We found records that he was in prison in Cumming, Georgia, Forsyth County, for auto theft. And the last record we have of Paul Buchanan is in the 1930 census. He's an inmate in the federal penitentiary at Brushy Mountain, Tennessee. So that poor lad apparently didn't do well. Anybody else? There was a lady, yes, ma'am?
I was wondering why you went to the cemetery at 4 a.m.
It wasn't actually 4 a.m. It was probably about 6:30. It was before dawn on a cold winter morning. And all I can tell you is, my memory is I woke up that morning. We had finally put all the pieces together. I had it all together. I woke up early that morning with that thought on my mind and thought, this is the time to go out there right now. It didn't matter that it was cold. It's about a 10-minute walk from the golf course. And I just thought, this is time. This is time. Have you ever done that? Have you ever finished a project, found something, worked hard, and the satisfaction of doing it sticks with you? And the last piece of that was to go out there and just tell her in my own way, I found who you are. And that's the reason I did that.
Now, is this church off of the old Somerville Road?
It no longer exists.
Okay.
But if you, it is off the old Somerville Road. If you go up past Pleasant Valley North and go on further past the turnoff on the golf course, there's an old road that goes off to the left called the Central Grove Road. It used to run out all the way to the Mountain Springs Church, which is on the Berry property. It's now, that road's now closed because of the golf course, but on the, out past the golf course, you can still walk that road. And the little community was called Central Grove. And it consisted of a church and a school, a number of houses in the Flatwood section. And but Barry bought all that property in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. Jessie Avery was the last person to live out there. And she died about 10 years ago. And anyway, it's all Barry property now. Nothing left of the church, the school, the houses, none of it. The cemetery, it's not marked. It's about 100 yards off the road out in the Pine Woods. Anybody else?
Were there any pictures of the girl?
I've never found a picture of her. Don't have any realistic expectation of ever finding her. I did call her family. I tried to track down the half brothers and sisters that lived in Alabama. One of them was still alive when I called about 2006. She answered the phone, and I can't tell you how hard my heart was beating as I thought I was about to find everything that I had ever wanted, including possibly pictures. But she said, no, we do not know what happened to her. Never knew. We knew that we had a half sister. We knew she died, but don't know why, where, anything about it. And she said nobody else in the family remains that could tell you they're either dead or they're so old. We with dementia that they would not be of any help. One more question? Yes, ma'am?
What was what's your project now? Or was that your final?
Oh, no, no, no. I've written about 110 articles. It's hard to believe it's been that long. And about 20 of those are about Floyd County over the years. Most of them are emerging, but a couple about this area. Right now, I'm trying to think of something that would actually be of interest to the general public. I'm always hiking and writing stories about outdoor birds and flowers and trees. Not many people enjoy those. Oh, my current story is about a young man who graduated from Glen Academy High School in Brunswick in 1944, joined the Marines, and 6 months later was shot and killed at Iwo Jima. And it was the same thing. We didn't know why or how he died. And through a long process, we were able to cobble together a very detailed itinerary of how he started at Glen Academy and then ended up in the Marines and on Iwo Jima and how he died, the conditions under which he died. The 70th anniversary of the Battle of Iwo Jima, of the invasion, D-Day, is next month. And to coincide with that, we published the article. It's called He Was Ours and We Lost Him, based on one of his classmates' words in describing how they felt when the news came back that he had been killed in action.
Man, how did you get clued into that particular subject all the way down to Brunswick?
My mother's family is from Brunswick, and he was listen to this, he was my grandmother's brother-in-law's nephew. Not a blood relative, but when I was growing up, we would visit Brunswick, and my great aunt Louise, who was a beloved family member that loved telling family history, would always tell stories about Harris Steele, who was killed in action. She told it inaccurately to a little boy that loved World War II. The story was that he landed on Iwo Jima on D-Day and was shot in the head and killed. And it wasn't that way. He was ashore for 6 days before he was hit in the neck by shrapnel and killed in action. So that's how that story is. Little things. Yes, ma'am.
You know why they use so many small children in the mills?
Yes. Do you want to hear this? This is hard history. All right? Some people can be offended, and I won't do that intentionally. But because they didn't want black people.
Because the kids were so small.
Right. That's right. Oh, I'm sorry. You were asking a rhetorical question. That's right. There was a number of reasons, but in that era, they needed inexpensive labor, and they were not willing to desegregate the mills. They did not want black people working in the mills. So what is your next source of cheap labor? The children of the textile mill workers would work cheaply, a lot more cheaply than. But you're right. In working the looms, right? They could get in the wires and in the thick and work it much easier than the adults do. All right, anybody else? I've got some copies of our magazine. This is 2 issues back. The cover story is a Rome story. So if you don't have a copy, these are complimentary. Just pick one up. Hope you enjoy it. This is our best way of getting the word out there. We enjoy presenting Georgia history, as you can probably tell. It's a privilege to tell history fairly and accurately and truthfully, even when it's tough history. But it's often fun. Yes, sir.
Dan, about that same time, my mother had 2 brothers and sisters that died of diphtheria in York County about 1900, 1910. And also my dad used to say they would open the window and influenza. And that was going around about the same period, World War I think, probably 1950.
You had the 1919 Spanish flu epidemic, and I originally thought that might have been involved. It was not, but it would have been a logical thing. I've written a story about the Spanish flu epidemic in Armurchie. There's 2 people buried in the New Armurchie Church Cemetery up on the hill by the creek, and they both died of the flu. And so if anybody's particularly interested in the Spanish flu story, I'll do that another time. I'm sorry, and there was one more question.
Does your magazine tell how to subscribe.
Right, there are cards and so forth in there, and telephone numbers. We have a website and that kind of thing. We'd be glad to have you subscribe, but I'm just glad you listened. Anybody else?
When you gonna have another Civil War talk? Anytime soon?
Pardon?
Civil War.
I'll do it anytime anybody wants to. I can do several Civil War stories from here locally. All right, thank you very much.